Unsolicited advice has a bad reputation, and rightly so. Oftentimes it's not helpful and it can come across as insulting. But sometimes you feel like the advice you want to share could be helpful. So is there a way to share advice that doesn't annoy the recipient? There is, and I'm going to share 4 straightforward steps on how to do just that. First though, I want to be clear about the goal of these steps and also why advice often fails. The goal is simple: to be able to offer useful advice without annoying people. Importantly, the goal is not to offer advice that the other person always follows. These steps aren't about that. They're just not about persuasion. It's a pretty simple goal, right? Why advice often fails is a little bit more complicated, but understanding why can give insight into what needs to change for advice to work as intended. So, why does advice often fail? There are 3 big issues. First, advice is usually not tailored to the recipient. Problems don't exist in isolation, people have problems. So if you want to give useful advice about a problem, you need to take into account details about the person who has the problem. The relevant details will differ, but they might include the person's age, resources, or relationship to their family. And usually they'll also include the person's internal world, their beliefs, motivations, goals, values, hang-ups, etc. Advice that doesn't account for the relevant details just isn't useful. Now, it can be tempting to frame advice as what you would do in the same situation. But if you're not the one in the situation, why is that relevant? It kind of doesn't matter what you would do because you're not the one currently facing the problem. The second issue with advice is that it often carries an implication that the recipient is bad in some way. They're dumb or incompetent or just not trying hard enough. To be clear, that's almost certainly not the advice giver's intention. The advice giver just wants to help, and maybe wants to spare a loved one some frustration or pain by showing them a better way. The implication arises not from the advice giver's intentions, but from the mechanics of the timing. On the one hand, the person with the problem may have been dealing with it for days or weeks or maybe even years, a calendar increment of time. On the other hand, the advice giver may have only been listening to the person talk about the problem for just a few minutes, an hourglass increment of time. That's a wide gap, and so the implication goes something like this. Hey, I know you've been struggling with this for months, but I solved it for you in under 5 minutes, so you must be kind of a dummy, huh? Again, that's no one's intention. It's just an implication that sometimes gets inferred because of the timing. This implication can happen even if you know the person really well, and even if you've been listening to them complain about the same problem for a while. That's because time spent passively listening to someone isn't the same as time spent actively engaging with the problem. We'll get into that in a little bit in the first step. The third issue with advice is that it can sometimes be jarring simply because it's unexpected and out of the recipient's control. To understand this issue, it's useful to imagine some potential frames of mind that a recipient might be in when you give them advice. Do they feel like they're totally in control of the situation, and they just wanted to vent or share a story from their life with you? Well, advice might imply that you don't think they're in control of the situation. Do they feel like it's important to solve the problem on their own, meaning the solution is less important than the process of finding the solution? Well, then advice takes away that agency from them. Do they feel like the problem is unsolvable? Then advice might imply that they are not purely a victim of the situation, and that they have some agency in fixing it. If they have agency in fixing the situation, it might also sound like they are partially responsible for the situation. And they might be. Hearing that perspective might still be an upsetting surprise. Do they feel like there is no problem at all? Well then, advice can be jarring because you're telling them that there is a problem and that they just don't see it. That's not an exhaustive list of all the possible mindsets. Hopefully, though, it's enough to get a feel for the common thread, which is that advice can push an unspoken mindset pretty hard in an unexpected direction. Since the recipient doesn't know that the advice is coming, they cannot ask themselves questions like, are they open to advice? How open? What kinds of advice would be helpful or not helpful? What mental box do they want to put your advice in? Not being able to think through these questions in advance means that they don't have any control over your advice. Those are the 3 big issues with advice. We'll refer back to them to see how the 4 steps address each of them. The steps go in chronological order. What to do before giving advice, what to do in the moment immediately before giving advice, what to do when actually giving the advice, and what to do afterwards. Okay, on to step 1. Before giving advice, ask questions. If someone is complaining or venting or sharing a story about some frustrating situation, your first step is to ask questions. Not only do questions communicate that you're interested in the person's story, they help you gather information. So, what types of questions are good to ask? It's obviously going to depend on the story, but if you're stuck, there are a couple of broad topics that make for good questions. I'm going to go through these topics and give examples for each. The first topic is context. For example, is this something that's happened before? What did you do last time? How did that go? Or, I've never worked in your field. What would be considered standard in your industry? Or you can ask about feelings. How do you feel about what happened? Or, if he said the same thing to you only privately and not in front of your friends, do you think you would feel the same way about it? Unless you ask about feelings, it's easy to get it wrong. Sometimes you might think a person is upset because you would be upset in the same circumstances, but really they find the whole situation a little amusing, in which case, you want to know that before giving any advice and you probably want to hold off. You can also ask about insight. Why do you think he said that to you? Or, do you know what your coworkers are hoping will happen by following this plan? And finally, you can ask about goals and priorities. You sound really upset, and that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, so have you thought about what you want to have happen next year? Or, has this shifted how you're thinking about your job or relationship or friendship, etc.? Or, what's your biggest priority here? Most questions you can think up are probably okay. You just don't want to turn the conversation into an interrogation. You're not trying to uncover some hidden truth, and you don't want it to feel that way to the other person. You're just trying to understand what they're telling you. So, what's happening when you ask all these questions? Well, first, you are objectively learning about the person and how they view the situation. Their feelings, priorities, perspective, all of it. Which means that if you do later offer them advice, that advice can be grounded in your actual understanding of their particular circumstances. Hey! That handles the first issue with advice, that it's not tailored to the recipient. Let's check it off. What else happens when you ask questions? You are also increasing your perceived understanding of the situation. By asking good questions and listening to the answers, you're giving the other person the impression that you understand their situation. Not perfectly, of course, but probably more than most people, simply because most people won't listen attentively and ask questions for an extended period of time. So if you do put in significant time here, 20 or 30 minutes or ideally more, then you're going to give a solid and probably accurate impression that you do understand the situation. And look, that handles the second issue with advice, the time-based implication. You've now put in a clock-based increment of time. It's not the same as spending weeks on the problem, but again, it's probably more time than many people spend really listening, so it's going to diminish the implication quite a bit. I really cannot emphasize how important step one, asking questions, is here. To give useful and not annoying advice, you need to actually understand the situation, and you also need the other person to believe that you understand the situation. The best way to do that is by asking a lot of good questions. And now you're almost, but not quite, ready to give advice, which brings us to step two. Right before giving advice, ask permission. Say you've listened and asked questions and now you have some advice that you think could be genuinely helpful. Do you just blurt it out and wait for the other person to thank you? Well, you can. But you'll probably have better results if you ask permission first. What does that sound like? Hey, would you be open to a suggestion? Or, would it be alright if I shared my perspective on the situation with you? Or the most direct option, would you be open to some advice? Most of the time, people are probably going to say yes. After all, by this point, you've already asked several good questions, and some of those questions may have sparked some new insight into the problem or presented a new angle. So there's a decent chance that the person will be genuinely curious about the idea that you want to share. In my experience, most people say yes. Some people say no, and some people waffle a bit or sound a little leery, and usually I just take that as a no, or occasionally ask for clarification. And a no is fine. Good even. It lets you know that the person isn't receptive to advice, or at least not right now. So you can just not give any. Easy. And look, we've addressed the third issue with advice, that it's unexpected and out of the recipient's control. The recipient definitely knows the advice will be coming if they say they're open to it. And that gives them a moment to think through whether advice would be useful and to frame the advice. For example, if they feel like they're in control of the situation, they could say, I feel like I've got this under control, but I'm open to hearing your perspective. In other words, they can preemptively frame your advice, which lets them stop the advice from unexpectedly pushing their mindset in an unwanted direction. Asking permission gives a recipient control. This one thing can dramatically change how receiving advice feels. It can almost make advice feel like it's not unsolicited. But it very much still is unsolicited. The recipient isn't seeking out or soliciting advice from you. They're just saying that they're willing to receive the advice that you want to share. And those two things are not equivalent. Now, do you always have to ask permission? It depends. In time, you'll hopefully develop the type of relationship where advice can flow freely in both directions, and you don't need to ask permission, or at least not all the time. But if you're not there yet, then asking permission is a good idea. Okay, now it's time to actually give the advice, which is step 3. When giving advice, be specific and be humble. To be specific, draw on what you've learned earlier when asking questions. Your advice should be specific to the person and to their situation. What might this sound like? It sounds like you've got two big priorities, A and B. What if you tried C as a way to get the best of both? It doesn't get you everything, but I think it might get you what you're most interested in. Or, I think what Mark said is pretty upsetting, but I'm not sure you actually know why he said it, and I think it's important to be sure about that before you decide on what to do next. Obviously, it's going to depend on the specific situation. If you find yourself referencing earlier moments in the conversation, that's a good sign that you're tailoring your advice to the person. Hey, let's give a second check to the issue of advice not being tailored. The other part of giving advice is to be humble about what it is that you're giving and what it's not. You'll do better if you think about your advice as an idea or a suggestion. On the other hand, if you think that you're giving someone the one correct answer, you'll likely be disappointed when they don't see it the same way. How do you make advice sound like an idea or a suggestion? One way is to include words that make your advice sound tentative, like a theory. You can use phrases like, maybe you should, or what if you tried, or I think it might be a good idea. Words like might and maybe make you sound less confident, and that's a good thing. You probably shouldn't be 100% certain that you know what's right for another person, for the simple reason that you're never going to be 100% sure about the details of that person's inner world. If you use language that accounts for that uncertainty, your advice will sound more reasonable. And that brings us to step 4. After giving advice, expect nothing. Okay, you've given advice and you haven't annoyed the recipient yet, but you're not quite done. There's still time to annoy them. I mean, there's still one more important step. After you give advice, expect nothing. Nothing at all. Someone might take your advice and apply it word for word to their life, and if they do, that's cool. But they might not do that. They might think about your idea, and that might be the spark to begin thinking about the problem in a whole new way that you never even imagined when you gave the advice. But they might not do that either. They might tell you why your idea doesn't work. And if they do, that's fine. Ideally, that's interesting new information that they're sharing with you, and you want to treat it as such. What you really want to avoid is arguing your point. Even if it feels like you could have made your point a little bit better. Even if you feel like the other person just isn't fully appreciating how good your advice is, you gotta hold off. You've given your advice, and now it's up to the other person to evaluate that advice and decide whether or not to use any part of it. Remember our goal, to give useful advice without annoying the person. You've met that goal, and so it's time to stop. After all, someone accepting advice from you is not the same as someone giving you decision-making authority over their life. The vibe you want to go for is, hey, I really care about you and I think you're competent and smart and capable of solving this problem. I hope the advice that I shared is useful, but if it's not, I'm just excited to hear about what you do next because you're in charge of your story and you're awesome. If you keep that vibe and follow these 4 steps, you'll find that people are generally more willing to receive advice from you. And over time, if you also seek out advice from the person and gracefully accept advice when it's offered to you, you might find that you develop more relationships where advice can flow freely in both directions. And that your relationships are a tiny bit stronger and your conversations are a bit more interesting as a result. Alright, that's it. You, dear viewer, are awesome. Thank you for watching, and if you want, maybe give me some advice in the comments. That'd be pretty cool. Thank you.